Cost of living remains a primary focus ahead of next week's interest rate decision from the Reserve Bank. Inflation has come down from its peak in December as the RBA board considers whether it does push a pause on the run of rate hikes. Joining me now is Greens Senator Janet Rice, who's also the chair of the Senate References Committee on Community Affairs, and you're doing a poverty
That's right.
review right now.
Big inquiry into poverty in Australia.
A big inquiry, and I know that today you introduced a bill to Parliament, the Anti-Poverty Commission is what you're calling it. Doesn't that overlap with what the government agreed to with David Pocock, that Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee? Isn't it sort of reinventing the wheel?
We really welcomed the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee as sort of a first step, but the government set that up as an interim committee, and they also set it up so it's not truly independent of government. And they appointed a former minister to head it, and it's not transparent. We don't even know yet how much information will get out, whether we'll actually finally see the committee's report. So the bill that I introduced today really takes what has been begun with the Inclusion Committee and makes it truly independent and truly transparent, and really would establish something that would be overseen by a joint standing committee of Parliament, the same way that like other commissions are, to make sure that it really is giving the best advice based on the best evidence about the impacts of poverty and establishes what a poverty line should be, gets an agreed national definition of poverty.
So for our viewers who might not recall, the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, that was set up by the government. It's an interim committee set up in their negotiations with David Pocock over the IR bill, but you're basically wanting to give it a bit more structure?
Structure and permanence. I mean, the government has committed that they're going to introduce legislation to make it permanent, and my bill today basically sets out a framework that we would say, look, implement my bill that I've got here that has independence, it's got transparency, it sets up, the parliamentary oversight and makes sure that it's not being constrained by the government policies of the day. I mean, because we know that the terms of reference for the advisory committee, which they didn't make public, I had to get them out of them, at estimates. We know that they say that they've got to take into account the government's budgetary constraints and policies of the day. So we don't really know whether its advice that's going to give to government is going to be truly what the experts and independent experts say what needs to be done to tackle poverty.
You want a bit more transparency and governance of it.
Absolutely.
Now, on poverty in Australia, we've been talking a lot about interest rates as the result of inflation, but with inflation it just means prices are higher.
Absolutely.
So poverty has soared in recent times, hasn't it?
Yeah, and the people that it really impacts the hardest, obviously, are those who are on the lowest incomes, who just can't afford to sort of have the extra, pay the extra $10, the extra $100 for as electricity prices soar. And we've got people who are on income support, whether it's JobSeeker, parenting payment, youth allowance, student allowance. They are living in absolute poverty, and they really struggling to pay the rent, put food on the table, pay for their medical expenses. And in my poverty inquiry, we've heard such heartbreaking stories of people basically who are starving, who are not eating, who might only be eating one meal a day and trying to pretend to their kids that they're okay as they're feeding their kids. And so you have the increases from the skyrocketing cost of living that they are having to cope with. And people it's going to be a full-blown social crisis. It already is heading that way.
Now, on to the advice to the government from that panel that we spoke about earlier. Jenny Macklin's on it, this advisory thing on economic inclusion. One of the suggestions they're making is to boost support for single parents. Do you welcome that?
Look, welcome that if that comes out, but it's not enough. I mean, and we don't know whether it's actually going to be reinstating support for single parents after their kids turn 8. And that's what the previous Labor government, in fact, when Jenny Macklin was minister, she chopped off single parenting payment, which used to extend until kids were 16 and dropped that down to 8. So we don't know yet whether the committee is recommending that goes up or that the rate goes up. And from our perspective, the rate of income support for everybody, not just single parents, has got to go up to above the poverty line.
On the housing bill, would you have liked the Greens to get on board with that? Because the Housing Future Fund is about affordable and social housing.
Well, it's just it just
But it's a
doesn't.
start, isn't it?
It doesn't tackle the scale of the problem. I mean, and plus the way that it's being set up, it's basically gambling $10 billion on the stock market. And in fact, if we'd had that set up for the last 2 years, there was no guarantee that there'd even be any money spent on housing. And we've got a scale of the problem of hundreds of thousands of extra homes, affordable and social homes that need to be built. Even if it's working, the government's fund would only be funding the construction of 30,000 homes. So not even touching the sides of what's needed. So rather than, $500 million a year, the Greens say to tackle the size of the housing problem, we need to be investing at least $5 billion a year. And we can do it. It's a political choice to decide whether to be spending that money to be lifting people out of poverty, having a roof over their heads, or spending money on stage 3 tax cuts.
Yeah, the home it's a big part of that story. Senator Jeanette Rice from the Greens, thanks. Appreciate your time.
Thanks very much, Kieran.